So today we're going to be talking about some difficult things, so some trauma and things around childhood. And so I want to make sure that everybody feels safe and feels okay. So please make yourself comfortable, make yourself feel safe, ground yourself. Please keep your cameras off if it feels better and leave if it feels too overwhelming. If you need support, please contact your networks of support, your family, your friends. And you can always message me or Heather, or if you're in the UK, you can text shout to, I'll put the number up there, 85258 for free, and you'll be connected to a volunteer for an anonymous conversation by text message, or you can call 111. If you're not in the UK, you'll have some health services around you that you can contact. I will have the chat up all the time, so if you do want to just raise a question or a point or say anything, please do put it in the chat and I'll try and address it as I go along. So today we're going to start with some introductions. I'm going to introduce myself, and hopefully you can introduce yourself in the chat as well. And then I'm going to do a talk for about 20 minutes on something that I wrote that was published in the Commoner magazine in 2 parts earlier this year around adverse childhood experiences and how anarchism can help us to overcome some of these challenges that are very, very serious and need addressing almost straight away, really. After they've done that presentation, Heather's going to put us kindly into breakout groups, and then I'd like you to think about some questions that the presentation has raised for you. It doesn't have to be about the presentation, it doesn't even have to be about the work. It could be something on a complete tangent. That's absolutely fine. And then we're going to put those into the chat, then have a little comfort break, come back, and then go through those questions, talk about them together, discuss them in groups, and then come back and we'll all feedback and discuss. So this is not a definitive thing that I'm talking about. This is my thoughts around an area. So as an introduction, so these are my thoughts that I sort of gathered. My background is in philosophy and politics. I was a lecturer for about 10-15 years, and I'd studied quite a lot around anarchist theory at that time. And then I moved into the areas of mental health, into child and adolescent mental health services, into some areas of child protection around attachment, and recently have been working in GP surgeries with adults about trying to create social networks. And within all those professional things, I am an anarchist, and so within teaching, I always try to do non-hierarchical teaching, focusing on inquiries. I never graded any student work, much to everybody's horror, until the Tory coalition government came in, and when it became no longer possible to teach in that way is when I left. And then within child protection, within child and adolescent mental health services, I always have worked from a strengths-based approach, focusing on the skills and the things that people actually have within themselves, and trying to empower people in order to make change that they can do, rather than a more medical model which sees there's something wrong with that person. And so the adverse childhood experiences came to me when I was working with child and adolescent mental health services in the UK, and I went to a conference on trauma, and Karen Wiseman was talking about these. Now, currently, in any kind of social work or mental health, there will be there's massive detail about adverse childhood experiences now. At that time, there wasn't. It was quite a new thing. And so therefore this presentation, I suppose, or this piece of work came out of that experience in that conference, but then thinking about it through an anarchist lens and thinking about what was actually said, and hopefully through this presentation I'll be able to explain that a little bit more, but also about solutions. So I want to be solution focused. What practically can we do for our young people, our children, and also us as adults who are dealing with these deep, difficult trauma kind of things and experiences that we have in our childhood. Okay, so that's me, and my name's Carrie. If anyone would like to introduce themselves in the chat, that would be lovely. If you could just put your name, if you want to, it doesn't have to be your real name, just put a name, where you're coming from, and any thoughts or what's brought you to this place, and that would be great, and I can try and address those as we go along. Heather Ellis is saying they've lost their sound. Is everybody else okay? Or Susanna, I think it is. Okay, lovely. Good news, Susanna. Lovely. So yeah, if you want to put any of your names in there and anything you want to introduce about yourself, that's fantastic. We've heard from a few people, but if you don't want to, then that's fine as well. Okay, just let me know how you're all doing. Okay, lovely. Okay, so I'll start a little bit of a chat then. So adverse childhood experiences, as I said, I went to this conference and we talked about adverse childhood experiences and just what they were. So my first experience of this is just understanding what they are. And the first research was done in America, and it was a GP, and she was working in her surgeries, and she realized that the people that were coming in with quite complex physical health and mental health needs all had experienced difficulties as children. And she started to realize that there was like a connection between what happens to us as children and what our physical and mental health outcomes are. And so she's decided to do some research into this. And so this research was done, as it explains on the first slide. They were all done by mostly white, middle class, upper class, college educated people in great healthcare. Okay, next slide, please. Hi, Mona. Okay, lovely. That's nice. Good to know. Check in and let me know if you're okay. Jenny. Okay, yeah, privilege and power, definitely. So the shocking thing that I found about the adverse childhood experiences, I was sitting in a conference with mental health professionals, social work professionals, education professionals, was that with an adverse childhood experience score of 4 or more, the likelihood of chronic pulmonary lung disease increases by 390%, hepatitis by 240%, depression by 460%, and attempted suicide by 1,220%. So we're talking about life-limiting things. We're talking about children. What happens to children in their childhood will impact not only on their mental health, I think I kind of knew that before I went in, but on their physical health. This is life-limiting stuff. So it confirms, on a good note, that there are social causes for mental and physical health challenges. That's good. It made that connection, which was great. We go to the next slide, please, Heather. It then said that adverse childhood experiences are common. 61% of adults surveyed across 25 states recorded that they had experienced at least one type of adverse childhood experience, and 1 in 6 they had experienced 4 or more. And when we experience 4 or more, that's when we get the physical health, really desperate physical health statistics. Shocking. Okay, they're common. 1 in 6 have 4 or more. Next slide, please, Heather. So what's going on? So why does it happen? Why does it affect our physical and mental health when we're children and we experience some kind of trauma? And I'm not medical, but I'm just going to kind of explain it as I understand it. When we experience some kind of trauma or adverse childhood experience, it causes toxic stress in our bodies. So a set of hormones are released, cortisol, adrenaline, etc., and they're quite toxic. They're quite toxic for our physical organs as well as our mental health. Also, when children are developing, there has a plasticity of the brain. Their brains are developing too. We know now that children are not just born with brains intact. These develop throughout their childhood. And it's not really until the age of 25, perhaps even 30, that our physical brains are fully intact. And I imagine it a bit like furrows. When we get that first fight, flight, freeze response as a child, maybe we've experienced some domestic abuse, it almost creates like a furrow in our brain, if you think about it like that, like a ploughed field, and it's a furrow. So we've experienced one fight, flight, fear situation as a child. We don't feel safe, and that creates a pathway in our brain. And then what happens then is every subsequent fear experience, we are more likely to go down that pathway, which is the fight, flight. We're more likely to release those cortisol, those adrenaline, toxic hormones around our body. So it becomes a sort of self-perpetuating thing. the more we experience, the deeper the experience, and it becomes so difficult to get out of that journey. I can see some people have written. Hi, Maura. Okay. Thank you. Hi, Anushka. Oh, okay, lovely. Hiya, Anya. Okay. And that's, you know, the things that you're sharing, you know, that 1 in 6 people have experienced, certainly in the USA, maybe more in the UK, I don't know the statistics, have experienced one or more of these adverse childhood experiences. And they affect us so profoundly, our physical and mental health, because our brain has this plasticity when we're young, and then that makes us more likely to then keep experiencing these toxic hormones. So we might experience 4 adverse childhood experiences when we're children, but then every time as an adult we experience systemic oppressions, we experience it again. We keep on experiencing it, and every time we do that, it affects our physical and mental health, because we've already set the program in our brains. That's already there, that the world is a threat, that it's not safe. We already know that, our brains know that, and so we become hyper vigilant around everything. And that's why all oppression is not only mentally harmful, but it is physically harmful for us. It is life limiting. It will reduce the quality of our life, and it will reduce the length of our life. So why is this? Why do loving families become so abusive, at least in the UK and USA? Why is it so common? And why does it affect all economic classes? Because the first response is, oh, well, this is maybe it's about poverty. And it is true that there is one adverse childhood experience that occurs because you don't have enough food. So if you're in poverty and you don't have enough food, and in the UK here we're experiencing a cost of living crisis, that is going to mean that millions of children around the country are already going to experience one adverse childhood experience because they're not going to have enough food. So being in poverty increases those chances of adverse childhood experiences. But it's not the only story, because that original study was done with middle class, fairly affluent people. So poverty adds stress, but it's not enough. But what economic wealth does is it protects economic wealth. So you can get a stockbroker who might be an alcoholic and have lots of physical health problems because of his adverse childhood experiences, but the network of support around economic wealth, the private schools, the private networks, enable them to continue to hoard that private wealth, but it won't protect them from the stress and the health risks. It just doesn't protect them, and other than the private healthcare that might come with it. So it's not just about poverty, it's about something else about the family. And as an anarchist, it puts us in a great position to be able to analyze this, because we know that hierarchy and domination, when power exists, are what causes abuse. We know that any system that has hierarchy within it will increase domination and oppression for those people. And we know that children are always within hierarchies. They're within hierarchies within the family, within school, just in the world in general, because they are vulnerable, because they can't do things for themselves when they're very young. So children are always within hierarchies, they're always in possibilities of feeling oppressed, and they're also vulnerable to abuse. Thank you, Heather. Could we have the next one, please? So this is the bit that could feel quite difficult for people. We're going to go through some of the questions. I'm not going to read them out, but you can just read them. These are the actual adverse childhood experiences questions that are asked to people. And I'm just going to use a case study on each of these. So I'm going to talk about some people that I have worked and supported. They are real people, but they're a combination of people. So I'm not going to be using real people, but I'm sort of combining them together, if you like. And just talk about what we mean by adverse childhood experiences and what I mean by oppressed identity. So I don't want to call them adverse childhood experiences. I sat in that conference and I thought, I don't want to call them adverse childhood experiences. That sounds like something accidental, or something, oh, I've just had an adverse childhood experience. No, you haven't. You've had something really serious happen to you, which could limit your life chances. That's not okay. It's not okay to call it an adverse childhood experience. This is for me, these are degrees of hierarchical damage. These are the degrees that have been damaged unto us because we are born into hierarchies. And that's what we need to be really clear about, because if we're not clear about that, we're not going to have a solution to that. So the first one is about emotional, physical, sexual abuse. And I'll talk to you about somebody I know called John, who experienced sexual, physical and emotional abuse as a child from his family. And he had many physical health problems as an adult. He experienced pain almost all the time. He used substances to try and get through the mental health problems that he was also suffering from. Sadly, he died at 60 when I was working with him. It was a very sad time. He always went back to those experiences as a child. What he was told by the adults around him who were abusing him was that he was not compliant, he was naughty, and therefore he deserved these punishments in the form of abuse. This identity, this oppressed identity, the story we are told by adults around us that tell us why we deserve this abuse, was what he carried with him all his life. So he always felt like he was not okay, that he was naughty, that he was not compliant, and that led him from relationship to relationship, experiencing the same things, experiencing the things that told himself that he was not good enough, that he was not a compliant person, those kinds of things. And he was unable to really settle at a job ever, or withhold and sustain relationships. So we know that children are always at the bottom of hierarchies, and we know that asymmetrical power relationships can lead to abuse. The Me Too studies showed us that when there are asymmetrical power relationships, abuse is always possible. Why do loving parents do this? Because often in our families, the love that we have within those relationships are the most profound and amazing and beautiful experiences that we ever have. It's not true that always families are like this. And in all my work within child protection and everything, I've never found parents or carers who really deliberately want to harm their children. I find parents and carers who've themselves been harmed. This can go back through generations, who just don't know how to do anything any different, who are often isolated, who don't have networks of support. But what can happen within families is when parents or carers often see their children as their property, as theirs to possess. And they often come out with phrases like, you know, oh, well, he's lazy like me, or he's not good at maths like me. Those kinds of things where you're almost providing a sort of sense of ownership over your children, that they are like you. And what we know from various work on oppression is that often people who abuse other people will not regard the person of abuse as a person in their own right. They will regard them as an object to be oppressed, as theirs. And sometimes within families, that's what happens. We regard our children as ours to do with what we want to do. They're a bit like us, or they're a bit like the other person that's parenting them. And they have our weaknesses, and they might have our strengths too, but we fail to realize that they are authentic, free individuals. And that's what we really need to do to stop the abuse. We need to make sure that we see our children as authentic individuals that can make choices for themselves and don't have to just do what we want them to do. So John's oppressed identity impacted on his entire life and how he saw himself. And the hierarchical damage that he experienced through the emotional and the physical abuse led to serious mental health issues, led to substance abuse, and led to an early death, which was incredibly sad. Next slide, please, Heather. The second two questions, I think I've accidentally put too many words on the first one, so forgive me, are about neglect. And a lot of the stuff that we understand about neglect comes from the Romanian orphanages, and what happened to those young people and those children when they were not given love or basic needs weren't met. And that can lead to serious learning difficulties because the brain hasn't had enough stimulation when it's in that really important part of growth and plasticity. And neglect can happen through omission or commission. You know, we can commission neglect because we can decide to hoard resources or keep resources away from people. We can decide we're not going to give food to people. We can decide we're not going to give whatever they need to people. Or it can be by omission. We're so tied up with our own stuff, we forget about the needs of our children because we've got so much of our own stuff to deal with. Because I'm worried that I can't pay the bills at the end of the week. I then am absorbed with that worry, and then I can't provide the basic needs for my children. And that's terribly, terribly upsetting. And that number 5, where you don't have enough to eat, because that is systemic abuse, isn't it? That's abuse from the state, from the world that we live in, where people and children are not kept safe. And just because of that, because of a cost of living crisis in the UK, designed by government and by fuel corporations, means that some young people will already experience an adverse childhood experience, which would have a massive impact on their lives moving forward and their physical and mental health. The experience of neglect, the case study that I talked to you about, is a woman called Pauline. She experienced terrible neglect as a child, and I first started working with her when she was in her late 50s, and she would still talk a lot about her childhood and the neglect that she experienced. She lived in a house full of things, so she collected things all the time. Her house, you could barely get into it. It was full of stuff that she was emotionally really connected with, and this caused her a lot of problems. She would fall. She experienced lots of physical health problems because of the early neglect as well. She didn't look after herself very well. She didn't eat very well, and she ended up in a domestic abuse relationship, and her whole life had been driven by this early neglect that she had felt. And the oppressed identity, the reason that she would talk about herself as just not being worthwhile. And this is what she carried with, she wasn't worth it. She wasn't worth anything. And this is what she carried through with her all her life in her oppressed identity. And she would get into lots of situations, relationships and experiences where she felt unworthy of them, and then ended up in possibly in more abusive situations. And that's how that manifested for her. Next slide, please, Heather. And then the last set of questions is really, I think, about the transgenerational aspect of these things, of hierarchy, that, that parents also, our parents' parents, they don't come in to do anything to us, but they also have experienced hierarchical abuse. They've also been born into a family where they've been vulnerable and they wanted their needs met, but they weren't met, and so that other things have happened. And so those things can then impact on them, and how they parent and care for us as children. And so that's the last 4 questions. So there are not many questions, there's only 10 questions in this. And they're not actually, I know that if I look through them, I can identify some that have impacted on me, and I'm sure you all will too. The person I'm going to talk about around this was somebody called Gail, and she came to me. She was in her late 60s. Her son was a heroin addict, and was being quite abusive to her, was trying to live with her and take things from her. And her she'd had parents who had also had some of these things. Her dad had gone to prison, and things like that had happened to her. And then this story was continuing to be told, and her identity was that she was weak, that she was weak. This is what she had been told by her parents, that she was a weak person. And this meant then that she continued being weak with her son, who probably had the same narrative told to him, because she would say, he is just like me, I can't do anything about this, he is just like me, he is weak too. And so it goes on, and so it goes on. And again, lots of physical. I mean, she was, when I was last working with her, she was in bed because she was in so much pain continually. She could no longer get out of bed. And she had a heart condition as well. So it's very complex, the way that these adverse childhood experiences, which we're not going to call them anymore, the hierarchical damage done to us in families, then has this physical health problems as well, which really impacts on quality of life as well as length of life. Next slide, please, Heather. I can see there's some stuff in the chat. That's fine. Lovely. Okay. So the conclusions that I came to after being in this conference and working in the places that I've worked are that the family is not always a loving place. It can be a loving place, but it can also create oppressed identities for children because of the stories that are told to children by the adults in their lives about the reasons why they're experiencing the abuse that they experience. And that the quantity of these adverse childhood experiences, we could understand as degrees of hierarchical damage caused within family, within schools, within wider society. And that early oppression that we experience as children causes emotional, physical, and mental health problems. Early oppression is deadly. There are broader conclusions, yeah, that through these early experiences of oppression within families, we then are more readily submitting to oppression later on in other hierarchies. And also that we then continue to experience toxic stress at every subsequent oppression that we experience. And this again impacts on our physical and mental health. Next slide, please, Heather. Okay, so the most important thing really is we can understand this. Now, mental health services, social care services in the UK, they understand adverse childhood experiences. And they say that what will work, what works and what helps is a network of support and one consistent adult. But they never challenge what's going on within the family itself. They never challenge the hierarchy. They just put these little plasters on. And when I work with adults who've experienced hierarchical damage, the last thing they want to do really is go back into a social network, because actually their experience of social networks is bad, oppressive. They're going to get hurt. They don't want to go back into them. So how can we change this as professionals, but also as people? How can we make sure that when we ask people to go into social networks, these are loving communities? These are communities that are not dominated by hierarchy, that they're not going to experience further oppressions, because that's really serious. And how do we try and change the family? How can we change the family so that it is not such an abusive and hierarchical place? So obviously there's lots of family abolition stuff in anarchism, and often it talks about communal aspects of child rearing, and some of that I think is really, really useful. But the problem with it is that it ignores that there has to be a hierarchy. So there has to be a hierarchy for children, because when they're born, they need their safety needs met. And we need some adults to take ownership of that. Because if we have neglect, we then already start adverse childhood experiences or degrees of hierarchical damage. So there is a necessary function that's hierarchical, and that's around safety. But what we can do is we can split off part of being in a family, the contingent function or the accidental function, which within capitalism is around this hierarchical stuff. And we can change that, and we could make that be non-hierarchical and mitigate the necessary hierarchy. So we don't want that power relationship anymore, but we're going to use part of a function of family to mitigate against the necessary function, the necessary hierarchy, which is that of safety. Heather, could you move it on? Okay, so we want the necessary function. We need a family where adults have identified responsibility for keeping a child safe. That's inevitable. So we stop our young child from crawling into a fire or drinking a thing of medicine. We want those basic needs, those safety needs. We need an adult present to be aware of those needs for as long as that's necessary. But we could mitigate against this the problem that might arise from this necessary hierarchy, where power can be used, by developing loving, nurturing relationships through mutual aid, through conscious, non-hierarchical structures within communities of families. Could you move it on, please, Heather? So I think what I started thinking about was, rather than a communal way of bringing up children, what would be really good if we start thinking about the degrees of hierarchical damage, the questions, would be to have groups of families getting together and maybe meeting up once a week, and maybe they would do some conscious work on the danger of hierarchies together. They would do reading, they would look at what is the problem with hierarchy? Why does this impact on children so much within families? How can we together make sure that we aren't doing that when we provide this necessary safety part of the hierarchy for children? So what would be good about this is they could create resources, they could do reading, non-hierarchical processes could be developed, they could just have that conversation, that dialogue all the time. The individual families would maintain their autonomy, so they could act as challengers for other adults. So often what can happen, certainly in communal childcare situations and in institutions, is that adults start colluding with each other around abuse of children. I've seen that many, many times within schools and within colleges. So we don't want that. We want adults to be sufficiently critical friends of each other, to be challengers around what's going on, because we don't want adults in collusion to abuse children. And thirdly, also, children obviously have to be given a voice in those meetings. They count as an adult in decision making, and that everybody contributes together within those groups to discuss how things are going, to be consciously, explicitly embedding the values of non-hierarchy, and be consciously aware that hierarchy is dangerous. So the mutual aid community becomes an active process of flourishing and thriving, engaged in producing non-hierarchical, non-abusive relationships. The community becomes a social and moral good. Because sometimes what happens with communal child rearing is that we forget that hierarchy is just dangerous. It doesn't matter which of us are in it, it's dangerous because it's about asymmetrical power, and that can lead to abuse really, really easily. So we always have to be on our guard. And with children, when we're providing those safety relationships, we have to be mindful that we have power, and we have to be able to mitigate that in some way. And I think mutual aid could really provide a great solution for this, both for families, but also for professional relationships and in social work and all sorts of different ways. But if we can get people into community together to talk about these things openly, I think that could be really helpful. Next slide, please, Heather. Okay, so that's the end of my thoughts on it, and these are just my thoughts. I'm not claiming any expertise on this, other than the fact that I sat through this conference and I was so aware that there were assumptions being made that were not challenged, and the assumption is that the family as it stands is the way we have to do things. But actually, if we can kind of dig down to that and go, actually, hierarchy itself is abusive. We know that. We don't need to be told that. What we need to do is put things in place to stop it hurting and harming our children, because that is actually going to shorten their lives. So Heather's going to put you into some groups, I hope. Thank you very much, Heather. And if you could just think about any questions, and it can be about specifically about this or on a tangent, and then type them up into the chat. And so we're going to be in there for how